Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Schoharie Crossing's History at Home Winter Lecture Series. I'm Dave, you're the audience, and I'm very excited about this program this evening. Tonight, we have Matthew Zembo, who is an assistant professor of social sciences and history at the Hudson Valley Community College. He has attended SUNY at Albany and received a Bachelor of Arts in History. He also attended the University of London for his Master's in War Studies, currently pursuing a PhD in military history through King's College of London. He is a unit commander for the 34th Regiment of Foot re-enactment organization from the Capital Region of New York State. He is married with a lovely wife and two adorable children. And again, I am very excited about this program. Please, Matt, take it away.
Good evening, everybody. I just want to say thank you, Dave, for having me speak tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about the history of the 34th Regiment of Foot on the Northern Frontier in the American War of Independence. I'm going to go through a little bit of the background history of the regiment before we get to that point. It's an interesting regiment. It's got an interesting story. Research, if people have seen me speak before, some of this stuff is going to sound familiar. But I'm also thankful for Dave for letting me pass on some of the new stuff I've been working on over the last couple of years. First off, the regiment starts out, hold on one second, I'm not used to all this technology. The regiment's formed in 1702. Its home is Carlisle Castle. It was formed and under the command of Robert Lord Lucas. It takes part in Queen Anne, what we call Queen Anne's War, but the War of Spanish Succession. It has a pretty, serves in Spain and with Marlborough in Northwest Europe. So it's seeing a lot of action in that time period. This here, you get the representation of what a soldier in the regiment looked like. I kind of joke around with this slide because the soldier on the right on the horse is how I think a soldier sees themselves, or a reenactor. And the image on the left is really what other people see when you're an actual soldier or when you're a reenactor. After this War of Spanish Succession, the regiment goes on to garrison the West Indies and Ireland. The image up in the left-hand corner is a little later from our time period, but it gives a sense of, the housing in the West Indies. You'll see the cane sugar being harvested, and then if you go down, you'll see in the corner, the left-hand corner, the countryside of Ireland. What's interesting here is notice that you don't see the regiment garrisoning North America yet. A redcoat before 1755 is a very rare thing in North America. The other thing to pay attention to when we talk about the garrisoning of the West Indies and Ireland, is to look at the operational, the different environments that the regiments of the British Army are operating in. You go from the tropics to Ireland to the Mediterranean. So it's a pretty wide range of operational environments. Now, as we move on from there, the regiment will have served in the War of Austrian Succession. It did take part in the Battle of Fontenay. If I remember right, it played an important role in the British victory at Fontenay. I am not an expert in the War of Austrian Succession, but I am starting to have an interest in it because I'm understanding that it actually influences, it has a big influence on the way officers were thinking going into the American Revolution, along with the French and Indian War. Moving on with the War of Austrian Succession, you'll see that the regiment also took part in the Battle of Culloden, so that can anger all of our Outlander fans. April 16th, 1746. I had the opportunity to visit Culloden, and it was a pretty interesting battlefield to visit a couple of years ago, and I highly recommend it. So you can see fighting the Highlanders there. After the Battle of Culloden, the regiment returns back to Europe and takes part in the rest of the War of Austrian Succession there. And then after its operations there, it comes back to England. And then, of course, the 7 Years' War breaks out. And the 34th Regiment is going to be on the island of Minorca. And it's not going to do too well there. It will have to surrender in 1756 after the siege of Fort St. Philip. If you look to the far left, you'll see the images of the Grenadiers in this Morier painting, and the 34th member is right there, if you can see on the far left. And you can see that because Minorca fell, Admiral Byng, who was the British admiral in charge of relieving Minorca, failed and was then shot. So it's not a good idea to lose in the 1750s. Moving on, the 7 Years' War, after they were surrendered at Minorca, the regiment was redeployed to Cuba, and it took part in the siege of Havana. And this is where we start to get into the area that's relevant to the Revolutionary War time period, because when the British Army laid siege to Havana, large numbers of troops that had fought here in North America in the French and Indian War were deployed to lay siege to Havana. And this means that the regiment is going to be exposed to a lot of men who fought in the wilderness in North America, had faced the French, faced Native Americans. And one of the things that they would have noticed is the Spanish were actually terrified, because when the British Redcoats charged the line, and this is in Stephen Brumwell's Redcoats, the British Army had adopted some methods from North America. And one of the things they did when they charged the Spanish lines is they did Native American war whoops, which completely terrified the Spanish, from what I understand. So moving from Havana, now the regiment is in the Western Hemisphere, and it will deploy to North America. And all of this is going to be relevant, as you'll see, because we're going to start talking about a thing called institutional memory, and the idea that an army can learn from its experience. And in 1763, after the siege of Havana, the 34th Regiment of Foot will deploy to St. Augustine, Florida. You can see the Castle San de Marcos on the right, and you can see the map of the town of St. Augustine. You can go to the fort. It's one of the coolest places I've ever been, so I highly recommend going to St. Augustine. But what's interesting here is that the regiment deploys in newly conquered Florida, and then one of its officers is given a special mission. And this mission is actually pretty cool. And you'll see that the officer on your right is Lieutenant John Ross, and he was the lieutenant of the Grenadier Company of the 34th Regiment of Foot, and he's given a very special mission. His job was to be, in 1765, was to ascend the Mississippi River and map it for the British government. So he's actually going to be one of the first, British presence in the backcountry, in the Illinois country, kind of asserting, British dominance after the French had been, lost the war, the French and Indian War in 1765. And then if you look in the background, you can see there's a letter. And that letter is from an Alexander Fraser, who is in the process of exploring the backcountry for General Gage, who is the commander-in-chief of British forces. Alexander Fraser was told to go into the backcountry and kind of, write a report about what he saw and what was going on. And in this letter, it's absolutely hilarious. He talks about the fact that when he gets to Illinois, he was preceded by one Lieutenant John Ross of the 34th Regiment of Foot by 7 weeks. So, here we have this, lieutenant going up the Mississippi into, in a time period where the backcountry was pretty volatile, to say the least. Pontiac's Rebellion was just over. And what we find is, here's Alexander Fraser. And if you don't know a lot about the Revolution, Alexander Fraser is one of those people who was, they say went native. He lived amongst the Native Americans. He enjoyed the backcountry. He had a Native American wife eventually, from what I understand. And then during the American Revolution, he will actually become an officer in the 34th Regiment of Foot. And he will be the commander of the Select Marksmen, which in 1777, which were British soldiers trained to be rangers, like good shots and what have you. So, it's kind of interesting how these paths cross, but it was also really cool to find this letter in the Gage papers at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan. There's something about holding the actual document and the signatures of the very people that you've been studying for a long time. One of the signatures I came across there was John Hancock as well, writing to General Gage. So that was kind of cool. What we find is that Lieutenant Ross was just the beginning of the deployment of the 34th up the Mississippi and into the backcountry. Here's the map that he made. One of my friends, Marcio of the 8th Lights, made me a copy of this map that I absolutely adore. And if Marcio wants to put his business down so that they can people can order this map from him. But this is the map that was made by Lieutenant Ross, and this map actually became very important for quite some time as one of the best maps of that region. As the regiment was going, Lieutenant Ross was followed by the by the rest of the regiment. And in the last half of the 1760s, the regiment's going to be garrisoning the backcountry, specifically Illinois was one of the major area they were occupying. But when we look at this time period, the British Army was trying to occupy and lay claim to a lot of territory that had been French. The local Native Americans had good relations with the French and were not happy in any way, shape, or form with the British being there. So it's a pretty hazardous duty, and it's a pretty scary duty to say the least. And you can imagine being a redcoat out in supposedly what was the middle of nowhere. But we're going to talk about that idea of the backcountry being the middle of nowhere, because come to find out, thousands of people live out there. It's just, they're not white people, so people tend to look at it as a wilderness, and it just wasn't. The first place that the regiment shows up would be Kaskaskias in Illinois. And you can see here that the remains of the fort are there. It's your typical Vauban-styled fortification. And then as we go through and we look at, here's a map of where the Crown forces are located in 1766. And if you look at Illinois, that red dot says the 34th Regiment of Foot. All right. This is important because also if you look at this map, if you get the opportunity, this idea of institutional memories is fairly important, because there's a list of regiments here that I'm going to read off that are all going to be part of the Northern Army, the army that invades upstate New York in 1777. The first is the 34th Regiment of Foot, which is in the Illinois territory. Also understand that it was scattered throughout that region into very small forts. There were some garrisons that were literally just 10 to 15 men. And this was very inefficient, and the British government's going to have to deal with this idea of, do we want a lot of these forts, or are we going to consolidate? And they're going to start to consolidate as the 1760s unfold. So the 34th is in Illinois. The 21st Regiment of Foot was in Florida and in the West Indies. The 29th Regiment of Foot at this point was deployed in Nova Scotia, and of course would later be infamously stationed in Boston to take part in a massacre, actually a bloody riot in my opinion. Then looking on, as we look at this time period of the garrisoning of the Western frontier in the 1760s, the letter on the right is a letter to Gage, or from Gage, actually talking about the deployment of the 31st Regiment of Foot in Florida to represent or to replace the 21st Regiment of Foot. And the 31st Regiment of Foot would, of course, be in Burgoyne's in the Northern Army as well. And then, of course, just other regiments that would be in, the 47th Regiment of Foot, of course, will be in Boston just before the American Revolution. But the reason that I mention this is because all of this is important for the idea that these regiments were deployed to North America and had experienced North America long before the outbreak of the American Revolution. By the time these units go back to England and Ireland, they're going to, go through a period where, men leave or what have you, but there's going to be a hard core in these regiments of men who've already been to North America by the time they come back. Ross will be an important officer. There's Ian Steele, who's an officer in the 34th. Adolphus Harris, John Adolphus Harris will be an officer who's the light company. These are all men who are going to have experienced the backcountry. And so when they come back in 1776, I'm going to be honest with you, in my opinion, they've probably seen more wilderness than most Americans, or more of that backcountry, and have operational experience there. They know what to expect. Seeing a Native American to them is not going to be something new. And come to find out, the 34th, in the research that I've been able to do, 1/3 of the men had been to North America and served during this time period before they, came over to fight in the American Revolution. So looking at all these regiments, there's I'm going to say that there's probably a good 1/4 to 1/3 of the men who had been to North America before they come back to fight in the American Revolution. So there's nothing new under the sun. Okay. Here's the Fort Chartres. This was another major fortification that the 34th was occupying at the time. It's interesting to read the letters because when a regiment's on garrison duty, a lot of the letters that the officers write, they're talking about, fixing the fortifications and the maintenance and stuff. And it's also interesting because I've been through the Haldeman papers, the Gage papers and the Clinton papers. And it's interesting because there's always these officers' field notes, and they're constantly writing, writing to the commander-in-chief with, situation reports and stuff like that. And some officers are chattier than others. So you get a better idea what's going on at certain fortifications or certain regions. One of the regiments that's the chattiest is going to be just before the American Revolution is the commander of the 8th Regiment of Foot stationed at Fort Niagara. He's got to be one of the chattiest officers out of the correspondence that I've seen. The guy was constantly writing and giving updates. But what's also interesting in this time period is that the officers in these fortifications tend to be fairly junior, and yet they're doing some serious diplomacy with the local Native Americans. One of the things that is fascinating from this time period is the officers' reports on the constant councils that were occurring at these fortifications in the backcountry, where the British were, trying to, maintain sovereignty over the Native Americans, maintain alliances or create alliances. So you'll find very junior officers, doing some pretty serious stuff that's kind of above their pay grade. Okay. Well, eventually, the 34th will make its way to Philadelphia, and here you see some 18th century images of Philadelphia. And the last muster roll I have in North America is Philadelphia, 1769, before they embark for Ireland, where they're going to head home, and they're going to be on the Irish establishment. For those that don't know, the British Army, there were two establishments. There was the British establishment and the Irish establishment. And essentially what you'll find is that to save money, the British government used to foist half of its army or more onto Ireland and make Ireland pay for it. So you're starting to understand possibly why Ireland would be a little less happy to be in the British Empire than other parts of the empire. What we find is that when the army is, when the 34th is actually sent to Ireland, it's an interesting time period because not only are there disturbances starting to occur in North America that are, going to have massive consequences and lead to the American Revolution, but the time period that the 34th is garrisoned in Ireland, there's going to be some really serious civil disturbances there. Related to the agricultural revolution and the coming industrial revolution. One of the biggest uprisings or civil disturbances is going to be the Hearts of Steel, the Steel Boys, who are angry about the Enclosure Acts and the agricultural revolution and the nature of the way it's changing farming and the fact they're losing jobs and status. They will, there's going to be some serious civil disturbances. And I just recently found an account, because this is an area that I'm doing constant, I'm just starting to research and try to find more information on. But there's some serious engagements. I just found an engagement where an officer of the 55th Foot, I was given this by Peter Green from the museum, an officer of the 55th Foot talks about actually having to take on 2,500 men, 2,500 Steel Boys, and that's a major engagement, and shots were fired. So this is some pretty interesting stuff. So why is this important? Because when the British Army is garrisoning Ireland, you have to look at the idea that they're a heavy police force, they're a heavy police presence. They're, not only are they're constantly patrolling, they were scattered. We know from the way they were garrisoned, they're deployed across the countryside to sort of maintain the legitimacy of government and the rule of law. They're in a hostile environment in many instances. They're in small parties, patrolling, and they're under the gun. A lot of these guys are going to have seen some sort of violent contact with an enemy. The 34th Regiment of Foot, what gets interesting about them is that during these civil disturbances, I started looking at our reviews, which you can see here. And reviews are sort of interesting because if you look to the far left, there, it tells you what equipment they had and all this other stuff. And there's other parts of the reviews that tell you the age of the men and whatnot. And it's from the reviews that I found out that almost a third of the 34th had served in North America and were still serving in the regiment in 1775. The reviews are interesting and the relationship I found with these disturbances. If you look at the 1774 review, you can see here that it says, this regiment made a pretty good appearance, though they have labored under many disadvantages, having been last year cantoned in several small villages in the north of Ireland, from where they were marched to the cantonments of Kerry in this province, and had been but 10 days together when I reviewed them. There are several old men in the regiment. Looking at the regiment's review, what this is telling me, most of the Steel Boys insurrection occurred in Northern Ireland. The 34th was garrisoning Northern Ireland to put down this rebellion. It was doing patrol work up there, and then it was asked to go all the way to the south of Ireland and partake in a review. And as far as the review is concerned, what that is that each year the regiment is reviewed. And what I, not only do they look at the equipment they have, but they look at how they move. Do they know the evolutions? In essence, do they know the drill? And what Blakeney's saying in 1774 is that these guys have been working pretty hard, and the fact that they got together and they were able to do a good job says a lot about the regiment. Now, 1775 gets interesting because the person reviewing the regiment, General Irwin, is less impressed, but he says this regiment would be fit for service if the officers took as much pains as the men. One sees them, you can see that the men performed the manual of arms good. Their appearance was clean and good. Their muskets were clean, but unserviceable. That's important to pay attention to because it means if you shot the gun, you'd probably kill yourself. And they were in need of replacement. But his most critical observation, as I look, you look at the review, is that large-scale evolutions and maneuvers were performed indifferently. And he goes on to criticize the officers for being unsteady and inattentive. What happened within that year? Well, prior to 1774, we can look at the idea that this regiment was, in police actions and, heavy patrolling. It was, isolated in small units across Northern Ireland. It comes down to Kerry. And when it's in Kerry, one of the reasons it was probably brought down there, again, this is all stuff that I'm working on as we speak, or, at the moment, Kerry became the site of even more disturbances in 1774. So the 34th was probably busy doing all of the same stuff it did in Northern Ireland before it was marched to Dublin to all of a sudden perform these big maneuvers in conjunction with everybody else, with a couple other regiments. And in my opinion, the problem that you run into if you're doing these type of patrols and stuff like that in these small garrisons, you rarely get to work together as a regiment. The one thing you can work on is the manual of arms, which is the immediate, where do you put the musket and how do you, march and stuff like that. But working in a big group is a heck of a lot harder. It is a very, very difficult thing to do to suddenly go from working in groups of 10 or 15 men to, being asked to work with 500 other guys. And so, this is why I think they weren't so hot with the evolutions. The other thing is that being the commander-in-chief in Ireland was a thankless task. Notice that in 1774, the commander-in-chief of Ireland was a guy named Blakeney. And yet, if you go over, you look, General Irwin, let me see if I got his full name because he's got some ridiculously long title. I'll just call him General Irwin because, you can see him there reviewing the troops in Dublin. I would take it that Irwin's basically new to the situation. He's been there for less than a year. He might not know what the 34th Regiment of Foot's doing, other regiments are doing, and not understand why maybe there's some issues there. When he says that the officers are, unsteady and inattentive, maybe they're hungover from the good officers' mess the night before. But the reality is that many of the officers that he's calling unsteady and inattentive will eventually in North America achieve some pretty high ranks and play a very, very important role in the American Revolution. But what you need to understand is that this time in Ireland is important. Notice I said, working in small tactical units. This is going to be crucial for fighting in the war on the frontier. Okay, so let's go to our next slide. 1776, it looks like we're going to be going to North America and fighting the American Revolution. The regiment is worked up before they go. We know that there is a lot of stuff going around as far as tactics are concerned. So I know that a couple people that are on this call today know who Townsend is, the former Lord Lieutenant Governor of Ireland in 1770, created some light infantry drills that were being disseminated throughout the army. At the same time, General Howe, who would eventually be the commander-in-chief in North America, was running some training sessions at Salisbury Plain in 1774 that are being disseminated amongst the troops in Ireland in 1775 and 76. So basically, they were working up to use these light infantry tactics, which is the idea of being able to fight in broken country and fight in the woods and all these other things. We also know that they're getting new equipment when they embark at Cork. Just before the 34th Regiment of Foot gets on the boats, they are issued a new stand of arms. And so that means they finally, now that they're actually going to be using the guns on a regular basis, they're given new ones, probably, given cartridge boxes, new bayonets, and what have you. This is also interesting for the people who are, really into equipment. The 34th only numbered 390 men in 1776 when they embark, which means that when they're over in North America, their agents are purchasing new equipment because in 1776, their establishment is going to increase. The British government's going to say a regiment can have more men. And so you're going to find that there's probably a mix of equipment or, new equipment being that you're not going to see in the review, but is going to be there in 1777, even if it's not in the review from when they leave. So they embark from Cork. If you read about the British Army embarking from Cork, each regiment was only allowed 10 wives to go to Quebec. And so from the descriptions, the docks at Cork were full of, screaming children and crying women and what have you, because God knows when's the next time we're going to see these folks. The 34th embarks on its ships and it convoys over with ships full of men from the 24th Regiment of Foot. And they meet up with ships that include men from other regiments as well. And in May of 1776, they have arrived in Quebec. And Quebec is going to be important. It's been laid siege to. By the time the 34th and the other forces arrive, General Carleton has relieved the siege of Quebec. The Americans have broken and they're heading out. So when the British reinforcements arrive, if the Americans were moving fast, they're moving a lot faster now in May of 1776 to leave. The campaign of 1776 is actually very, very important to my research. And the reason is that Carleton's orderly book is absolutely fascinating. As somebody who's really, really into tactics and strategy and what have you, Carleton does not get the credit that he deserves as governor and general of Canada. I mean, he saves Canada for the British Empire, in 1776, and he had very little to play with, But the other thing is that he goes through a whole series of, as they're on campaign, every day in the orderly book, what you'll find is that there's the orders of the day. And part of his orders of the day, in an orderly, only I and a few other people find orderly books absolutely fascinating because a lot of it is, so many men go get campwood, so many men pack up the baggage, take the baggage over to the river, blah, 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 and it's all this minor stuff. But then it's also in the daily orders where they share information. And in 1776, you'll find Carleton is starting to talk about all of these tactical innovations and what have you. And he's going into great detail about it. But of course, my favorite part of the whole story of the Quebec campaign is the Empire's back. Yes, that was a real image that I found on the internet. I'm not sure if Darth Vader would have driven a Kia, but the Empire's back. And, when you're reading the orderly book, the reason I put Darth Vader there is because I want you to read the order from Chambly on July 16th, and I want you to use Darth Vader's voice. It is absolutely hilarious, and I mean, I'll try it. I can't see your reaction, but here, it's like, the commanding officers of the Corps will take every opportunity to instruct and exercise the troop in the use and management of boats. Embarking, rowing, forming with celerity, also in attacking and boarding boats or armed vessels, that they may be expert in these exercises should the rebels be foolish enough to attempt opposition in either element. It's awesome stuff. And when you put it in Darth Vader's voice, it makes reading in the library a little more fun. Notice what he's doing there, though. One of the things that Carleton's going to do is he's putting in there, we're going to fight in all sorts of different situations. I mean, literally what he's talking about in here, and there's a little bit more, if you look at the actual orderly book, he describes on making boats with ramps, and it almost sounds like Higgins boats from World War II. He's really looking at the idea of we're going to be fighting on Lake Champlain, and damn it, we're going to win. The other thing that he's doing too is he's talking about all sorts of tactical innovations. Like he talks about shooting at targets, instructing the men to shoot at targets. He creates the select marksman. And what we find is that the idea is that, you point the gun. And one of the things that they mention at this time is that combat ranges in the woods of North America are going to be 10 to 15, maybe 20 yards. So a Brown Bess musket's going to, second model is going to be perfect for that because, you're going to be within a shooting range and be able to hit what you're pointing at that range. So what we find then is that the other thing that I found about Carleton's orderly book too is that he talks about the idea of the units being ready, able to break and form. General Phillips at this time writes letters about how the men should be able to work in small units. Notice that this is all stuff they've already done in Ireland. So keep this in mind. These guys in the 34th Regiment of Foot have already been, a third of them have been to North America. They get here, they're exposed to guys that are, already have experience and are sharing information with them. For example, the 47th Foot is going to have some innovations that I'm not going to get into details here about wearing equipment that I think went Army-wide, with cartridge boxes and cartridge pouches. And then the other thing is that the officers have been here, okay? They've been shot at already, and if not shot at, they've been in violent situations. And now they're told, they're let loose and told, chase the Americans out of Canada. And that's what they're going to do. They fight one major action at Trois-Rivières. Sorry, my French is absolutely atrocious. I haven't had enough to drink to make that accent. And, they chase the Americans out. But the whole time, Carleton is constantly looking at how to improve the Army. But one of the other things I've noticed about this orderly book is that I actually believe that there are 3 to 4 different voices writing in the orderly book talking about tactics. Sometimes I think it's Burgoyne. Sometimes I think it's General Phillips. Sometimes it's General Carleton. And then I have not read enough of Simon Fraser's papers or anything like that, but I sometimes think that Simon Fraser is talking in there as well. So it's kind of cool when if you study this type of stuff and you know what I'm talking about when I say the voice, that the voice changes at certain points. So it's good stuff. So we talk about these tactical innovations in the uniforms. If you notice, I got a quote up here. The British Army pushes the Americans out in 1776, but by June, they're at the north end of Lake Champlain of 1776. The 34th Regiment of Foot is part of that process. But they need to build a navy to take control of Lake Champlain. That's the highway. Without a navy, they can't do anything. So we know that at the north end of the lake, they continued a lot of these practicing different formations and what have you. And so what we find is too, the other thing is that a British redcoat is very uncomfortable in North America. One of the things that soldiers have done since the age of the Romans is that they want to be comfortable when they kill people. God forbid, no offense, but I don't want to wear a necktie while I'm trying to stab somebody in combat. So what you find is that the British soldiers were modifying their uniforms. And here, talking with Gregory Irwin out of not Tulane, but down he teaches down in Philadelphia, and he writes a lot too. But I sent this quote to him: "The clothing of many of the regiments has not been sent out. I have learnt that schemes are pursued in the furnishing of the clothing of some regiments which are by no means conformable to any orders of His Majesty, which I have ever seen, or to the usual practice of the Army. This is what's important, all right? It's the men. They are the ones who are changing their clothing, all right? They're doing it on their own. And what's really interesting to me is that this letter is written to Lord Barrington November 17th. And what Carleton didn't realize was that at the time, the uniforms had actually been captured. The replacement uniforms had been captured by John Paul Jones. He captured on a British ship called the Mellish. Carleton had no idea the uniforms weren't coming. And so what he wanted, and so what happens is the men start to modify the uniforms. And you'll see that they wear short coats. You'll see that in some images, the hats have gone from tricorns to caps. The caps, the caps that are ever, some of them have visors, some of them don't. As far as my research, I like uniforms. It's not the most, I enjoy it. But what I'll tell you is that it's my personal belief that the uniform modifications happened in such a way that some regiments did what they, did what they wanted to. Some of them, you'll find that some men made pants. Like if you look at the soldier in the left-hand corner, they have on what you would, you can see are trousers, a gator, they're gaitered pants, basically, essentially jeans, and they're made out of canvas. You look at the men in the center, you'll see the different caps they have on, and they have leggings on. Other men had breeches, and still wore the gaiters with stockings. And then, of course, you look over at the sailors in the far down in the right-hand corner. They've got on round caps. And this image up on the left circle at the top is from England, but you'll notice they have a style of cap that was popular as well with some, regiments. It's as far as I'm concerned, I think that you would find there was quite a lot of variation from regiment to regiment, and I would even argue that there might have been some variation from company to company within a regiment. Men will do what they need to do to get comfortable when they're killing people, and it's a proven fact. I mean, all you have to do is look at images from any war where you can get photographs from, and you'll notice that the men are all given the same equipment, but everybody wears it different or modifications are made. This does not mean that they weren't uniform. It just means that there's a certain level of do what you need to do to get comfortable, as long as I can, make an argument that it's within regulations. What you'll find is that in the spring of 1777, Burgoyne is going to give an order where he says to make trousers, to cut the hats and cut the coats and all these other things. And it's my personal belief that what he was doing was he was basically putting into the orderly book, he was given permission, he was making it official that everything the men had been doing for the last year was acceptable. And by putting it in the orderly book, he's saying, look, I know you guys did this, but it's okay. And let's be honest, it looks kind of cool too, So go on to our next slide. So now we've got this thing called the Northern Army. And one of the problems that one of the things that I'm working on, this is a soldier from the 53rd Foot. You can see the modifications. You can see the gaitered trousers. You can see that he's got patches there. You can see the coat's been cut down, even though he's light infantry. He's got a cartridge box. He's got a cap. In this instance, the artist has made it with a visor. But now we have something new, and in my opinion, it's called the Northern Army, and it was a new type. It was a different army from the British Army in America in New York. This was an army that was adapted for fighting in the northern backcountry, and it is an army that had its own personality. It had its own styles. One of the things you got to pay attention to is that some of the stuff these men are doing, they're doing what they think is fashionable, and things become cool. I mean, for example, one of the things that pops into my mind is like the angle that hats are worn at becomes cool. Uniform modifications also go like the Rhodesian armies. No surprise, they wanted to mimic, Confederate soldiers, and so they made their hats look like kepi from the Civil War when they were wearing them. So fashion becomes important, and so what we're going to look at then is that this idea of the Northern Army with the 34th as a member has a personality of its own, and a lot of authors from Matthew Spring and others, they talk a lot about tactics and whatnot, and they always talk about the British Army, the British Army, the British Army. I think it's time that we start talking about the fact that there was the British Army in America in New York, and there was the Northern Army in Canada, and they will eventually have two separate personalities, different tactics to a certain extent, just different personalities, different ideas of operations and where they're going to operate. And the 34th is going to be in the forefront of all of this. So what were they preparing for in 1777? They were preparing for the campaign into Saratoga. Of course, I'm not going to go into a blow-by-blow account of the battles of Saratoga, but what I will say is that off here to the left, you see an image of St. Ledger. He was given command of an entire wing of the invasion of New York. He attacked Fort Stanwix, which you can see there, the recreation at the top. And then here's what we have that's like these documents. The document in the middle is the last muster roll before the Saratoga campaign of the 34th in the middle. So it's got the numbers of men, what type of soldiers they are. And then over here on the right, in the top right corner, this is the actual return and muster of all of the soldiers who participated in St. Ledger's expedition to Fort Stanwix. Now, why is why is this an important year for the 34th? The 34th actually takes part in both wings of the two wings that are executed, the St. Leger and Burgoyne wings of the attack on New York in 1777. And the light companies and grenadiers go with Burgoyne to Saratoga. St. Leger takes 100 men of the 34th Regiment to Stanwix with him. And, so they participate in, the way they participate is that, they're in, the regiment's broken up and in two different wings of the Northern Army. This brings us to the idea, like what a regiment actually was, because I do know that there's some experts out there that are listening to what I'm talking about, and there's some people who may not know what I'm talking about. A regiment in the British Army consisted of 10 companies. One was a light infantry company, which their specialty was to be, small and fast and deadly. There was the Grenadier Company that was supposed to be, the bigger, huskier, meaner guys, although eventually they fight, pretty much like light infantry. And then you had 8 Italian companies. So that numbered, before they went to Canada, 390 men and officers. By the Burgoyne campaign, the the companies were raised from 38 men to 56. So it's about 560 guys in the 34th Regiment of Foot at the time of the Saratoga campaign. They were augmented with recruits from England, but the other thing that that's been discovered is that a lot of recruits were actually directly recruited from Germany. So there were actually guys in the British Army. They're not mercenaries. The British Army actually went to Germany, recruited these guys, and then threw them in the line. And it's kind of interesting because there's court martials and stuff where nobody knows what's going. The person that's being court-martialed doesn't know what's going on because they speak German and all their officers are speaking and charging them in English. What's really cool is I had somebody from Quebec get in touch with me a couple years ago, and I traced their relative from Germany in the 34th, and then the guy actually stayed behind and settled in Quebec, and he was a direct relative of somebody from our regiment, which is pretty cool. So this gets us to this idea of 10 companies, okay? Now, my thought is that companies on the battlefield deploy as a unit, right? You need 56 men, 56 men go here, they go there. I'm starting to think that unless a regiment was in a big group as the regiment, I'm almost thinking that companies were pointless. They were just for paperwork purposes. When you look at the return up in the right-hand corner, the 34th sends 100-something guys with St. Leger. And my first thought would be like, oh, send, such and such, 2 companies. But that's not what they did. What they would do is they would send 100 guys and they'd pick them randomly from all these different companies and then send them off with officers who are assigned to the job. So they're not deploying as companies, okay? The only companies that in this campaign that deploy as companies of the 34th are going to be the Lights and the Grenadiers, who are off with Burgoyne. And so I wish I had a blackboard so I could draw it out and kind of explain it. But it's just interesting to me because, like you're sitting there and you're saying like, well, why do they divide them up into companies? Really, I think it was for paperwork. It's the only, and it's something I'm working on, and it's something that, I'm talking to you about my new, some of my new research, and this is what I'm finding. Now, along on the Saratoga campaign, we know that the campaign is a failure. The 34th loses its light company and its grenadier company at the battles of Saratoga. They basically surrender, but here's an interesting part of the story with them. The commander of the grenadiers, remember Lieutenant Ross? Well, he's Captain Ross at this point. He basically is wounded at the Battle of Hubbardton and has to go back to Canada because he's wounded. John Adolphus Harris is wounded, the commander of the light company. He has to go back to Canada. All of the wounded from the Burgoyne campaign prior to the surrender were sent back to the major hospital at Quebec, or not Quebec, but Montreal in Quebec. And every regiment was asked, and again, this goes along with this idea of what's the point of a company. Each regiment had to leave the equivalent of a company behind in Canada to help defend Canada while the attack into New York was going on. And so over the winter of 1777-78, these companies that were left behind, they're not companies, they're company sized. But what happens is all the wounded from the Burgoyne campaign are thrown back into these units that have been left behind. And eventually Captain Ross and Captain John Adolphus Harris will return to active duty, and our regiment will reconstitute its light company and its grenadier company. The light company is reconstituted in May of 1779. I have the muster roll, and so that's that. So again, I'm sorry I'm not going through the whole Saratoga and Stanwix campaign, but it's the one thing that I think everybody knows. We know St. Leger's forced to go back, and it's a disaster for British arms. Well, here's where we have a major change in focus in the operations of the 34th and the Northern Army. It's all about raids and garrisons. What you're looking at now is that when I talk about that different personality, that new personality, this army has a different operational focus. It has its area of operations is technically, or its area of command is Canada. One of the things that I'm looking at is that as far as the Northern Army was concerned, it ran into a severe problem with working in conjunction with the British Army in New York, because the Northern Army raided into the area of operations of the British Army in America in New York. And then the problem is that the commander in New York and the commander in Quebec, they'd write each other all the time, but they never did anything to coordinate their operations. So these two armies are, the way they're working is they're almost working against each other by not working with each other. The 34th will, start to do raids into, the Mohawk Valley region. You can see some of the aspects of what garrison life was like. Some of my favorite stories are, or some of my favorite notes are how boring it was to take care of a fort, because they'd spend all summer fixing it, and then we have this thing in Canada and upstate New York called winter, and it would destroy everything they did, and they'd have to start over again. All of this idea of running into chasing, doing raids into the back, into the Mohawk Valley. The units were working in conjunction with loyalists and Native Americans, so there's joint operations with from different types of units that becomes fairly important. And then you'll see that working with Native Americans and what have you, and it was it's a pretty fascinating culture that develops with this army. And again, you can see some of the paperwork up here. This is when reinforcements for the 34th come into Quebec in September of 1777. So that's up in the right hand corner. And then the other thing is that when they're doing raids, as we'll talk about, these guys would be deployed all over the place. What's interesting though is that you get individuals that pop up, and this is Sergeant William McIntosh. This is a letter from Mason Bolton, the commander of the 8th Regiment of Foot at Niagara. And you'll see this is what he has to say about Sergeant William McIntosh. Made his escape from the rebels in May of last and joined Lieutenant Ferry and Joseph Brant, an active and brave soldier and one who has upon all occasions been extremely useful to him, particularly so at the battle, the action near Wyoming. What's really cool is that I've been able to figure out that this guy escaped from America. He was captured at Stanwix. I talked to Don Haggis about it, and he confirmed what I was thinking. This guy was captured at Stanwix. I figure out that he's probably being held captive at Easton, Pennsylvania by the Americans. He escapes. He somehow and this is important to pay attention to, because we always hear these stories about British soldiers who join the American army because they don't love their king. This guy is 44 years old at the time this happens. He escapes from the Americans, makes contact with Joseph Brant and his Native American and mixed loyalist party, and Butler's Rangers. He fights in the Battle of Wyoming, and then goes back to Fort Niagara. And Bolton's like, yeah, man, this guy's awesome. It's like, if you got the time to look at the rest of the letter, he goes on about how William McIntosh is, this great soldier and, lucky for the 34th. And then he talks about, and there's another guy that shows up with him, a guy from the 62nd. He's like, yeah, this guy's not so good. And these individual names pop up. Another guy who pops up that Don Haggis found, and I found the paperwork that Don used, was a guy named Moses Livermore, who was such a pain in the butt in the 34th that there is the correspondence is like, this is a guy that this guy can't be in the regiment anymore. He's absolutely disgusting. Get Livermore out. And that in the American Revolution, the British Army had a problem with recruiting, and when they're willing to kick somebody out of the army, the guy had to be a total tool. That's all I'm going to say on. So McIntosh is somebody I'm doing some more more research on. And again, these are the type of individuals that pop up in this correspondence. This particular letter is from the Public Records Office, and it's one of the officers' letters. The things you'll find about the officers' letters during this time period is that, again, some officers are fairly chatty. They'll tell you everything they're doing. Caldwell and Bolton, the 8th Regiment of Foot, their officers never shut up. But they were also in charge of some, pretty important posts at Detroit, and they're writing all the time about what's going on there. And some of the research that I'm doing on the Sullivan campaign in 1779, some of this has proved crucial as they're talking about shortages and the natives coming in after Washington had Sullivan burn out the Iroquois in the West. The other thing that's fun about these letters, again, are these characters who show up. And some of you who know me from reenacting in conversations over beers, I've talked about the one story that cracks me up is that at Michilimackinac, there is in the paperwork, in the Haldeman papers, in one of these garrisons, a sergeant stabs a lieutenant. And what I love about it is that there are two levels of paperwork associated with this. There are private letters, and then there is the official correspondence of a non-commissioned officer stabbing an officer. And you're like, what's going on here? In the private correspondence, it's absolutely hilarious because the officers are talking amongst themselves and they're like, Lieutenant so-and-so and Sergeant so-and-so are just despicable, disgusting people. And, I don't know what to do. These guys should just be kicked out of the army and shot or something. And then in the official, correspondence, they're talking about all the legal case and, what to do, the ramifications of a sergeant hitting an officer and all this other stuff. In the private correspondence, you finally kind of what's going on, and it comes on that the sergeant had been pimping his wife out and the lieutenant had refused to pay. And so the sergeant, being angry and wanting his money, stabbed the lieutenant, and it's like, but what's cool about it is that you could read like two veins of thinking on it. And what's even better is I read about it in the Haldeman papers and then went over to the official correspondence at Kew at the National Archives in London for the British. And, so you got two conversations going on, the one between the officers and then the official one of what they're dealing with. Other things that I found about in this paperwork too, if anybody's into this, court martials and stuff like that, Carleton didn't like to execute people. I know people had been executed in the Northern Army, but one of the things that he did is he sent men off to Africa. And I think that was the same as a death sentence in the 18th century, but I think he himself had a problem with, being the one to say, pull the trigger. And so that's one of the punishments that you'll find in the Northern Army paperwork is send them to Africa into a regiment there. Okay. And then with the garrisons, what you'll find is some of the garrisons that, would be Chambly. This fort is a great place to visit in southern Quebec. Highly recommend it. This would be the site of almost every regiment in the Northern Army, with the 34th being one of them, would garrison this fort at one point in time. And so you can see that that's one of the types of fortifications that would have been on, protecting Canada and where the raids would be executed from into the Mohawk frontier. St. John. Now this is the location of essentially the west point of the Canadian Armed Forces. St. John is in southern Quebec as well. It's on the Richelieu River, just south of Chambly. And then another type of fortification along the border would be these blockhouses. And you can imagine that it was kind of lonely being in these blockhouses and what have you. This is an original blockhouse from the time. There are numerous blockhouses along the border. As a matter of fact, the guy who got in touch with me about his German relative was actually manning a blockhouse in another part of Quebec. So that was kind of interesting to pay attention to. Now, here's the other thing about this idea of a wilderness that I'm currently working on. The frontier wasn't a wilderness. The area of operations that the 34th was raiding into and operating from, there were thousands of people that lived there, Native Americans. They had, the villages of the Native Americans. The Americans actually resented the Native Americans for having nicer houses than them. On the Sullivan campaign in 1779, and the Mohawk who lived in the Mohawk Valley, just prior to the American Revolution and during it, they had cabins, they had glass in the windows, and they had nicer houses. The Mohawk were renting land to whites, and the whites in the area were resentful of that. The other thing is that the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, depend on farming for a major portion of their diet. If you read about the Sullivan Campaign in 1779, the Americans have this amazing. They're there to exterminate the Haudenosaunee, but they're able to create this, or they execute it with this formation where it's just, it took up so much room. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, if this is a wilderness, how are these guys, marching in these big formations through this territory? And I did a research trip with a friend of mine who's doing some of the research with me. And it dawned on me, Haudenosaunee territory was pastoral. Thousands of people lived there. They were farmers. They had clear-cut areas and they were farming just like, whites. I mean, when you're reading the accounts of the American soldiers going into these regions, they're talking about the fact that it's absolutely beautiful. They have apple orchards, peach orchards, and and it's like this rich pastoral countryside. Were there patches of wilderness there? Yeah, of course, what we would call, the woods, but it's not empty. All the accounts of the backcountry prior to the revolution and during the revolution, if you were in the backcountry, you're constantly bumping into people along routes of travel. And it's not empty. This idea that it's empty or a wilderness is just absolutely ridiculous. Like thousands of people lived there and had a right to live there. And one of the things that I'm researching is that, the major American war aim of the American Revolution was to eradicate these people, to break them. And during the war, you'll find that the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and the Haudenosaunee are all broken by the Americans and unable to resist after the American Revolution. So, but that's another story. Fort Niagara was a major garrison point. I highly recommend visiting there. And at Fort Niagara, I've got the documentation of them where they're talking about Bolton is talking about the idea of fixing up the barracks because the 34th is coming. So that's kind of interesting to read at the time. And then, of course, the biggest loss of life for the 34th Regiment of Foot was the sinking of the HMS Ontario. Estimated to be October 31st, 1780. It takes off. It gets stuck in one of those big gales on the like the Edmund Fitzgerald, and just basically disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to it. Nothing washed up on shore that I've been able to find in any of the documentation. And they just found it in, I think, 2012, and you can see what it looks like now. It's almost perfectly preserved. It's in 500 feet of water, and they're not telling anybody where it is because it is so perfectly preserved. The total loss of life was a bit over 80 people. 31 of them would have been from the 34th Regiment. And of course, the 8th Regiment of Foot lost their colonel. Colonel Bolton was on his way home. And if he wasn't on his way home, he was at least on his way to Montreal and Quebec, and he passes away on when the ship sinks. 34th operations. The 34th Regiment of Foot, of course, was continuing to do these small raids. Operationally, one of the things that I talk about is this idea of the different personalities of the Army. The Northern Army is a raiding army. It's not going to be fighting big battles. It's fighting in these small raids and what have you. And so tactically, one of the things to pay attention to is that they set limited goals and objectives, which is area denial, to make the Mohawk Valley a place nobody wants to live. So their idea is not to take over the Mohawk Valley, but it is to make sure Americans don't want to live there, and they are very effective at that. It also means that when you read about the raids, you got to take them with a grain of salt, because a lot of times the Americans will be like, oh man, we kicked their butt and we made them run home. These are small time raids. These are raids going into enemy territory over hundreds of square miles of territory. These British units and Loyalists and Native Americans are isolated, and they're there to wreak havoc, not conquer territory. One of the things that they are doing operationally is whenever they engage, they're constantly looking at whether or not they're going to be able to extricate themselves from the situation. So, a lot of times they'll be like, oh, they ran away. Well, if they're starting to be surrounded, there's nobody coming to Herkimer to save them. There's nobody coming to Johnstown to relieve them on the battlefield. They're a small unit at the time. The largest raids were 1,500 to 1,600 men. So they're looking at ways to, extricate themselves and get the heck out of Dodge. And so what we find is, like Johnstown, if you look at the way that battle unfolds, that's going to be commanded by our friend Ross again. He's going to, make contact. And at one point, he seems to think he's getting surrounded. He's not there to take Johnstown, folks. He's there to wreak havoc and cause problems. And as soon as he thinks he's about to be surrounded, it's time to get out of Dodge. That's all there is to it. Fight to survive, and survive to fight another day. So keep that in mind. At the same time, it's funny though that there's the 34th is members of the 34th are on the Johnstown raid. They're also on a raid under the command of St. Ledger. So again, the 34th is important to these raids because the officers in charge, fourth officers, Ross had been made a colonel of the King's Loyal Yorkers by this point, if I remember right. Fort Ticonderoga, St. Ledger occupies Fort Ticonderoga. And again, to give you an idea of how good the British are, what they do, they come down, they occupy Fort Ticonderoga, basically put a flag up and say, here we are, what are you going to do about it? The Americans did nothing. They gather loyalists for, as they think about possibly reoccupying Ticonderoga. And in November, they withdraw back to the north and, taking some loyalists out of the territory. So the last two major operations on the northern frontier, the 34th took a big role in. And after, of course, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown, nobody knows what's going on. The sad thing is that the Native Americans were continuing the war, but by 1783, the British are done. You're going to laugh here. The reason I put Detroit Rock City is because the last place the 34th is going to occupy is Detroit. And so they occupy the frontier fort of Detroit. And a Thomas Hughes in 1784 writes in his journal, the 53rd Regiment of Foot is going to be replacing the 34th as the occupation force of Detroit. And the 34th, you can picture them waving and saying, have a good time, 53rd. We sure as hell did. And Thomas Hughes complains that the Americans constantly harangue them that the 34th Regiment of Foot threw better parties and were more fun. And so that's the last hurrah of the 34th. They'll go back, to Ireland, but their experience here, they're one of the more important regiments. Again, this is a short talk, so I'm working more and more on this idea of the Northern Army being different. But the 34th Regiment of Foot has a pretty cool history, and I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit about it. And besides, what other time are you going to watch a lecture on the 18th century and have Darth Vader and Kiss show up? So there you go. Thank you, everybody. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. David, where would they be popping up if I'm to see them?
They can leave some questions or comments in the chat function. And on your screen, there's should be, if you hover a little bit lower, where you're able to see your own sharing screen, should be a small thing that pops up with a chat, or I can just let you know what people are asking here. So anybody that has some questions, please put them in the chat and I can relay them as well. I was going to bring up a couple things that I wrote down while giving people a chance to type in a question here. Going to kind of work a little bit backwards in some of these, Matt, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
You had talked about some of the personal preferences and adaptations in the uniform. And I'm kind of curious on how those kind of relate, if they parallel very similarly or if they're drastically different than perhaps some of those earlier Ranger type uniforms like Rogers Rangers, and how that also parallels or otherwise can compare to Loyalist units, some of those adaptations that they were doing in their uniforms as well.
Basically, the best way to look at it is they're trying to be comfortable in their environment. They're doing things to make it easier to move through the woods and stuff like that. One of the things that I didn't get into is that the woods are a little more open. It's virgin forest in this time period. So you're talking big trees with a lot of space underneath them. We have this idea of the woods looking like they do today. They don't. They didn't have as much undergrowth in them as we do today. But yeah, a lot of these adaptations are things that the British Army and Rangers have done in previous wars. The cutting down of the caps is an easy one. I don't know about you, but I don't want to run through the woods in a tricorn, because you're constantly be hitting your head on branches and stuff. So yeah, some of the stuff is similar, but and again though, I think sometimes what it is people coming to the same conclusions.
All right. We do have a question coming in from Luann. If you could talk a little bit more about what happens after a regiment surrenders. You had mentioned early on that there was a surrender, and afterwards they went and fought somewhere else.
Oh yeah, it's it's a much different time period in the 18th century than obviously today. Like if we take prisoners, we're not going to hand them back over to the enemy. What would happen is a lot of times in the 18th century, army would you'd surrender and you would sign a parole, and basically the parole would be, you're not allowed. You can go home, but you're not allowed to fight in Spain anymore. But if you go and fight in North America, that's fine. So and you would do that for yeah, again, very different. Just like the other thing that you would see too is that they're allowed to leave with their guns. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm watching them leave with their guns, I go, what the hell is that? But that's the honors of war. You put up a good fight, you deserve respect, and go home and do your thing somewhere else. And that's how it worked. And then, of course, the Convention Army at Saratoga, they surrender at Saratoga, and they're basically one of the very first international agreements that the United States ever signs is the Convention at Saratoga. And the British Army there was supposed to be able to go back to Britain on parole and just never serve in North America again. And then we broke it. We said, nope, Congress said, no, we're not going to let them do that. And so Burgoyne's army kind of floated around all the way from, they marched out towards Boston. They marched down to eastern Pennsylvania. They marched down to Virginia. Guys escaped all the time. McIntosh is not the only guy who makes it back to British lines, and a lot more make it back and want to fight on the British side than want to fight on the American side. There is no love lost between the British and the Americans. So keep that in mind. So there's, different story depending on who you're surrendering to and when.
Right, and that's also a good question, because even into the 19th century and American Civil War, there's paroling that's going on, and once the federal government makes that point of saying we're no longer going to be paroling, that's where you have the establishment of these much larger prison camps, and it leads into things like Andersonville that most people are aware of, or here in New York, Elmira being a Confederate prison camp in New York, and actually is somewhat credited for helping to win the war, in which Confederates are no longer able to be paroled and then return to the field. So that's a really great question. I'm grateful that somebody asked that.
One more thing about the paroling process: even when they were in American prison camps, they could be paroled for the local area, and local Americans hated being near the prison camps because they worked cheaper than local labor, and so they undercut the local economy.
Nice. Right. Let's see. There's a question coming in about if you know which country in Africa some of the soldiers to be sent to. I believe you mentioned it's sort of a death sentence or a form of punishment, having them sent to Africa. Do you know which part of Africa that was?
It would have been to West Africa and the slave colonies, basically. Right. So I can't remember the names right at this moment, but like you think about the area where all the slave trade was happening in West Africa there, and they would have been guarding factories and whatnot. The factories, of course, being
Winston's comment is interesting. You say Northern Army soldiers changed their uniforms, where guards changed everything they had aboard ship from the UK to New York. We also had a nice comment come in with an interesting point from Paul Knight, saying, interesting point on the 34th, having a composite company to reconstitute the regiment. He states that he had found the same with the 47th, two companies that were not at Saratoga, returning to Quebec complete. But there's also a third company, which is not an original company, and it's raised from those other survivors. So that's sort of that reconstituting or consolidating of soldiers.
Yeah, so if you're still there, the other thing, I did a lot of work with the 9th Regiment of Foot, and Dobbins is the lieutenant in charge of the 9th company that's left behind. And I say company because that's the strength. 56 men were left behind. With the wounded after the Battle of Fort Anne and the Battle of Hubbardton, the 9th company that was left behind in Canada under Dobbins ended up being 80 men. And that company, I call it Dobbins Company, was deployed on its final possible combat mission in June of 1778 to Point au Roche, just before, it's just above Plattsburgh. I got the name on the tip of my tongue. And then after that, in July 1778, all of the companies and men left behind for Burgoyne's campaign were then drafted into other regiments. So, for example, with the 34th Regiment of Foot in the summer of 1778, we absorbed all of the men from the 21st Regiment of Foot, because the 21st, the majority of it had surrendered. I think for the 47th, if I remember right, you guys go with the 8th a year or two later. But so they were, that company that was left behind, gathering those men from the hospital, numbered 80 men for the 9th. And that's what happened with all those other companies. Carleton gave the order for the wounded to go back to these composite companies left behind. So,
we have let's see, Ben is saying or actually asking if there's one more slide on your presentation.
oh yes, there is. Sorry.
Yep.
And hold on a second. I didn't get to the last slide, and I can tell you why Ben wants us to go to the last slide.
All right. Does it happen to be the 34th slide?
Yeah. 1 second.
All right.
Ben's the guy in the middle.
All
This
right.
is the recreate. This is a couple of guys from the recreated 34th Regiment of Foot. We're reenacting the light company. My uniform is a transition uniform. I'm actually a battalion sergeant who's, in this picture, but moving into the light company. So
a shout out to Ben, and is that James next to him?
that's James.
All right. Shout out to Ben and James, and that's a great image. Luann's asking another great question about how much of a problem illness was for the 34th, and if it was worse in any particular country. And I'm going to tack on a little bit more on that question. If you could conjecture sort of an answer as to, so far as in that review, it was talking about how there was full of old men. Do you have an average age for a soldier in the 34th at the 1776 marker?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that in two different ways. The first thing about sickness, 18th century people are a lot sicker than we are today. I worked on the skeleton at Fort William Henry, and minor infections that don't bother us too much today because of antibiotics killed people all the time. I've worked on a guy at Fort William Henry who died from an ear infection. Like, you could actually put your finger in his skull. He had an open wound from an ear infection that eventually killed him. So there's a lot more illness, and when people get sick, there's always a sick call. When you look on the muster rolls, there's always a number of men who are on in hospital. Not always dying, of course, but coming back. The British Army actually inoculated for smallpox. Smallpox, it hit the American Army all the time because, freedom. I don't want a shot. And then Washington eventually had to force them to do the shot. But people died of illness. Any war, you'll find most of the time people, up until the Korean War, more men died of illness than they did of combat. But what you have to realize about the Northern Army is that the combat was far and in between. Most of the time it was boring, garrison duty and the raid where you had a couple seconds of terror and hours and hours of a lot of walking. As far as the average age, the men tended to be older, if I remember right, upper 20s, 30s, a lot of long-serving soldiers. You'll find too that economic historians should really look at the muster rolls because they also write down what they do for a living before they join the Army. And you'll find that there's going to be times where, like, a lot of farm laborers are joining the Army, or a lot of weavers are joining the Army. And that's an economic downturn in that industry. And the only option they have is either starve or join the Army. So you would find that these are not all like young kids. They're going to be, 20s and 30s. I mean, Sergeant McIntosh was 44 and he did not retire until 1789 back in Ireland. So, he's retiring in his 50s, and he joined the Army in 1752. He served for quite some time.
So a good number of career soldiers at that point.
I think I just saw a question from Tom, if people died of boredom. From what I understand from some soldiers that I've talked to, is sometimes people do stupid stuff, and I'm sure they did.
Yeah. Especially with some extra rations that might have been pilfered out of the rum barrels.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, that kind of leads into the boredom, but also the camp life. And one of the things that I've enjoyed in seeing some of your group's reenactments and being able to check them out on Facebook and other online sources is as there's a real civilian-like portrayal in those camp followers as well. I know we're bumping into about an hour and 15 minutes, but if you could talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned as they're embarking for North America yet again, families being left behind, but for those that were able to come along, or those that were recruited in North America, a little bit about the portrayals that the reenacting group might do, but also the importance of that auxiliary, that the camp follower, and the family support amongst the regiment.
Yeah, women and children would have been part of an army encampment. You got to look at an army as a moving city. One of the things that happens is each company was allowed 10 women to come over because women played an important role. If I hear one more time that, camp followers were, only there to service the men for, certain types of favors, that's absolutely ridiculous. They did laundry, they cooked, they were on the establishment, they were fed by the army. They had the children were dragged along, the children would be on the establishment being given food. They were really important for supporting, they were part of the logistics process. And of course, the thing is that wherever an army goes, soldiers meet women, and so initially they're only allowed 10 wives to come along. They come to Quebec, you got more wives, you've got a lot of intermarriage. I do know of several occasions where soldiers trying to come back to the Northern Army ended up going native, and they were discovered. One was a German, and he was participating. He was still, get this, he's a German soldier, right? He's one of these supposed mercenaries. He escapes, starts living with the Native Americans. A British officer finds him and says, "I should really bust you for desertion." But then one of the native warriors says, "This guy goes on every raid and he's a wicked badass. And no, he's actually, we like him, and please don't take him away." And so he's gone local. But what you'll find though is that the women play an important role, and it's one that I think is important for our portrayal. If you go to an army camp in the 18th century, there's going to be kids and there's going to be women and children. So
nice. I'm glad that you're presenting that to the public, and that that opens up that line of discussion, and we can step away from that narrative of camp followers being much more like groupies for KISS.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where if you want to know the truth, in the last few years when we're going to do programs, I'm really into the tactics. I'm into, the tech demonstrations and stuff like that. I enjoy the interpretation though. I enjoy talking to the crowd instead of fighting in the battles nowadays. I don't mind doing the battles. I mean, it's great therapy. I get to yell a lot, and anger management therapy. But what I have found is that the public has less and less, as the years go by in my reenacting career, the public has less and less interest in what the army is doing, and more interest in what the kids and the women are doing in camp. Because they're doing the everyday tasks. I mean, how many people are soldiers? The two gentlemen with me in this picture here are both, combat veterans. From the one, Ben is a Marine. James was in the Army. Both of them served in Iraq and Afghanistan. But in that instance, they've experienced the Army or the Marines. Most people don't, and so they want to see what did a kid do in the 18th century? What were women doing? I mean, you would be amazed that I laugh that the laundry demonstration has now become like the big attractor, and that's perfectly okay with me because it's an important aspect of what the Army was.
Very good point. And it looks like we've come to the end of some questions here, and I want to thank you very much for your time this evening and giving this wonderful presentation. I want to thank those that had joined in for the program and asked questions and been involved in this experience as well. So, Professor Zembo, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And if before you go, if anybody wants to email me, I'm at Hudson Valley Community College. It's m.zembo@hvcc.edu. If you got any questions, feel free to ask or get in touch with Schoharie Crossing, and Dave can get in touch with me. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Be good. Stay safe.
Take care. Thank you very much.